Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful series of interviews that we've been doing on a very, very critical topic of the India Pacific relationship that's really, really developing very quickly, with Australia and India being major stakeholders. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Dr. Bodean Hedwards. Dr. Hedwards, welcome. Uh, could you tell us a little bit right at the outset about all the work that you're doing? Usually I introduce, but I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because you've just done so much.
Oh, thank you, Rami, and thank you for having me on this really fabulous initiative. It's really great to be involved. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it. But my name's Bo Hedwards. I am currently the co-chair of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which is an incredible platform that brings young people from Australia and India together to really kind of build the important people-to-people relationships that we know are the foundation between the two countries. So I do that. I have a background as a criminologist where I've worked primarily on the way that governments and business respond to different types of exploitation. I've primarily worked in South and Southeast Asia within higher education institutions, but then also within a lot of different international organizations, local non-government organizations as well. And then underpinning all of that, I've also had a long love affair with India, and have been going backwards and forwards for quite some time. I had a fabulous, very small, but a very, very dear organization that worked basically to try and help fund a health clinic that was being established in Lucknow. But that's just a little bit about kind of where I'm coming to this conversation from.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I know the project is called the Million Hands Project, and we'll come to that. But let me begin by asking you, you've also worked on something called the Global Immersion Guarantee Program,
Yeah.
that has helped foster stronger partnerships between this critical India Australia relationship on the Indo Pacific. So, what could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Global Immersion Guarantee Program is an initiative that was designed at Monash University. And basically what it is, it's a 4 credit unit that is funded. And what it does is it provides students at the end of their very first year of their bachelor's degree to go to one of 6 countries where they study the human impact on the environment. And as part of that, not only are they learning from other universities, and so we partner with universities to deliver the program across the region, but they also have an opportunity to engage with and learn from local organizations and leaders that are developing responses to some of those really big questions that the region is going to have to answer, and the world will have to answer as well in the future. So the idea is that we take students out of the classroom where they get that first-hand experience in what complexities are involved in developing responses. But what is important about that is we situate them where they get an opportunity to be learning from the countries and the people within those countries, and particularly other young people, that they will be working with to design these responses in the future. So India is obviously one of them, and it's probably one of the larger programs as part of the suite of countries that students can go to. But what's really important about it, Rami, is that it's funded. So we know that international education in and of itself can be prohibitive and is often only available to students with the means, the financial and the social means, to be able to travel during their degree. So what Monash have really been able to do is remove those barriers. So by removing that, they're ensuring that all students, regardless of those means, can access what is usually, and more often than not, a really transformative international experience that we know shapes the way they will engage with the region, and they will continue to engage with the networks that they create when they're overseas. So that's now been going since 2018, and is a really incredible initiative, and will continue to grow across the region, and will continue to grow in India as well.
Uh, Burian, that sounds incredible because, like you said, it's funded, and the distances, let alone the costs of living in these places, can be very prohibitive for young students. What have you? The program's fairly new. It started since 2018. You said, but what have you noticed? This sort of interaction. What are the students' responses to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing to note here, and I think it really comes back to one of the reasons that it was developed, right, is if you can create the skills or create a platform for students to develop the skills, the knowledge, and the networks at the beginning of their degree rather than at the end, they then have an opportunity to be able to go back to these countries that they've developed those networks with, right? So the first response usually is so when we take them out of Australia, and many students will have never traveled before, many students will have never left Melbourne before, land in somewhere like Mumbai, and it completely changes the way that they view the world. And that's exactly what it's designed to do. It's really designed to push students out of their comfort zone, where they get used to working with uncertainty. They get an opportunity to be learning in different ways, and ultimately get an opportunity to see how they can use their degree to be addressing things like waste management, like climate change, like, all of these really big questions that we will be asking in the future. They get an opportunity to see their role within that, and importantly, how they would need to engage with a country like India to do so. And that's really, like, if I can think back to some of the examples on the first program, I know that students have come back to India to do an internship with the partners that we have on the ground. We know that we've had students across the region go back and study and do further study across the region, but it's because they were introduced to that country at the beginning of their degree, and it was made accessible. And that's a really key part for a lot of students, is that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do it. Now, a lot of the programs that we deliver, we partner with the New Colombo Plan, which is a Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade initiative, which is, it's a very, the Global Immersion Guarantee and the NCP have very shared values and a vision. If we can mobilize a generation of young people that have experience in the region, only good things will come from that. Where there is a deep understanding of one another, half the battle is won. And they're going to continue to go back, and students get a chance to see that early on in their degree.
That sounds absolutely fantastic work. It's so important for people to be familiar with each other's countries to create some
Yeah.
sort of that. I think this is exactly doing that. But you've done so much of other work, and it's so impressive because we've read through your bio and some of the work that you've done. You have done very deep research into human trafficking and the problems with slavery and things like that. So, could you tell us more about this research that you've done?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to seeing the absolute power that education can have in creating change globally, one of the things I'm also deeply passionate about is the fact that public policy needs to be grounded in evidence, and it needs to be grounded in really robust evidence that is drawn from people that experience those policies firsthand. So the research that I've been involved with across my career has very much been looking at how people at risk of modern slavery, which is a very broad umbrella term which encapsulates things like human trafficking, like forced labor, like forced marriage, like the worst forms of child labor. What is their experience with the systems that can either make them vulnerable to different types of exploitation, or can provide support for them once they get out of that situation? But the important part about it is that it's grounded in the human experience. So how do you then do that ethically? How do you do that in a robust methodological way that ensures that it can then be applied in a policy context? So I started very early on I finished my undergraduate in criminology, and I went to work for the Australian Institute of Criminology in Canberra, and was involved in a project there that looked at the risk of exploitation of migrant workers in the Australian construction industry. And that looked at the different systems that were in place and the gaps within the existing systems that meant that migrant workers could, or more often than not, were exploited in different parts of the construction sector. Then I moved across to the Walk Free Foundation. Now, Walk Free was established with a pretty bold vision, which was they wanted to essentially end modern slavery in all its forms in a generation, right? And a part of that effort was to try and understand what the state of play was. So how many people were experiencing a different different types of modern slavery, sorry. But also then what were governments already doing to try and respond and address the various issues and how that manifested in within their country context. So I was part of the research team that developed the methodology for how we then assessed government responses to this issue. I specialised primarily in South and Southeast Asia, and a big part of not only developing the methodology and using the research was then how you made sure that that research and the data was accessible and useful. So a big part of that was then deploying it. So I used to do training with police as part of the name is now going to completely escape me, the Asian Regional Management Law Enforcement Program. To work out how you use data to inform policing responses. So I was there for a couple of years, and then decided that doing a PhD and working full time was too much. So I returned to Melbourne, where I finished my PhD with Monash University. And during that time, I was involved in lots of different research, which again had that focus on how systems can either make people more vulnerable to different types of exploitation, or what are the systems that can support people. So I looked at the exploitation of migrant workers in Australia's agricultural sector. We looked at how exploited migrant workers across the ASEAN region, and particularly women, were able to access or not able to access services across the region. And then I moved on, and I moved into the role of leading the Global Immersion Guarantee. And I do still do a little bit of research on irregular migration and modern slavery, and what that looks like and what the risk factors are, but have largely been focused on international education for the last couple of years.
That sounds wonderful, and it's a very, very I think a very pertinent topic in this day and age, because we tend to look at slavery from the lens of history, and one doesn't realize that there are so many different types of slavery. So my next question might sound a bit naive, but it's coming out of sheer interest in the work that you've done.
Yeah.
Is you talk about modern day slavery in South Asia, Southeast Asia. What is an example of possibly something that we don't necessarily see as slavery, but it is amongst women?
Yeah. So look, I think it's really important to recognise that the Global Slavery Index released their recent estimates this year, and they estimated about 50 million people were in some type of modern slavery globally around 2021, I think was their data capture period. But what's important about that is a large majority of those are women and children. Now, within that, when you go down to an even more micro level, you're looking at things like the worst forms of child labour. You're looking at forced labour, which is essentially labour where you're not being paid. You are under horrific conditions. It's demeaning, it's degrading, and you have no way of leaving. Okay, now it's really important because these types of situations exist on a spectrum. Okay, so and that's a really important part. But if we think about those types of things, forced labour, bonded labour as well, where, for example, someone pays a migration agent, which may or may not be an actual registered migration agent, to help them find work overseas. Okay, so they take money from, loan sharks, they take money from family, from wherever they can gather that money, which puts them into huge debt. They then go overseas. They're not earning any money as a result, because it's, they've been basically fraudulently sold this lie. They're in a situation where they don't know the cultural context, the social context. In many ways, engaging with police doesn't seem like a plausible way to get out because of relationships with police in their home country. The other thing there will be things like language barriers. If you think about the Australian context, they might be in really regional or remote parts of the country. So actually getting out of these situations, there's also geographical barriers, but we don't think about what that looks like in an Australian context more often than not. We often think about it's an other, it's over there, but it's absolutely not. So that's just one example. Someone will take the money, they go overseas, they're not paid anything, they're then sent back, they owe everyone all of this money, and it becomes dangerous in other ways. Another way that people are forced to stay is with threats of deportation. You know, if you go back, if you don't do what you're told, or, you know, physical violence, all of those sorts of things create an inability to leave, basically. So that's one example. Human trafficking, again, there's this idea of recruitment. So you're sold an idea about what is being offered, you know, whether that is, you know, decent work in another country, whether that, or whether they know that they're going across to somewhere where it is going to be hard work, but it might be the only work they can access. So there's a recruitment piece there. There's a transit. So they're then moved from one spot to another. Now that can be international or it can be domestic. And then there's the exploitation. And that happens in a variety of ways. And that goes for women and men and children. Exploitation doesn't discriminate, just more different parts of communities and different groups within society can be more vulnerable because of, for various reasons. And there is a lot of research that goes into that.
That's absolutely fascinating. But you've done some more work which is really interesting, like Million Hands Project. What is the Million Hands Project about? And you know, it was started in Lucknow in India. Why did you choose?
Yeah. Oh, I remember a Million Hands Project so fondly because I was very young. I was 18 at the time. So I traveled across to India when I just turned 18. Now, I grew up in a very, very small country town in Australia. There were 60 people where I grew up. And I flew
That's
into the
almost
Delhi
like unimaginable to us.
Yeah. there were more people in the Delhi airport than I think I'd seen in my entire life. So I traveled around India for quite some time, and I met my now one of my best friends, Claire Robb, in an internet cafe in Nepal. And she was a nurse. She was studying in Queensland, and one of her really close friends was from Lucknow, and her dad had been trying to raise the funds to set up a health clinic. So we all combined forces and we held a bunch of fundraisers and brought together some nurses to go across and basically just get the establishment up, like the actual structures up. And then we took some nurses across that helped set up some different systems that were applied in that context or would be useful in that context. And look, it's not running anymore. They didn't need us. And that was the important part, is that we just did what we needed to do, or what they needed us to do, to get the establishment of the clinic off the ground. And it's still going, which is fabulous. But it was a lot of fun. It taught me a lot about working internationally, about the way that you collaborate and the way that you work across borders and the different institutions that would be involved in something like that. I mean, one of our fundraisers, we had artists involved, we had AFL teams, like it was a all hands on deck kind of experience, I think. But it was really good. So it's still going, but we don't. A Million Hands Project itself finished up a couple of years after.
Oh, that's wonderful, you know. But tell me, what was your experience, particular experience in working in the non-governmental sector in India?
Yeah, look, it's been interesting. And I have had the privilege of working with different NGOs, both in my academic career, within the context of international education, but also then with the Million Hands Project. It's always been fabulous. And I think what has drawn me to India consistently throughout my entire, basically since I was 18, I've continued to go backwards and forwards, is the ambition to have purpose and impact. That has always been my personal experience. That's not to say that there aren't challenges with working across borders or with working within different institutions, but mine has always been that where there is ambition and where there is purpose, there is a way that things can happen. And that's always been my experience.
Well said, Bodean. Let me come to my last question. You've also been a part of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And how do you think that dialogues like this, platforms like these, help in building stronger bilateral relationship between countries?
Yeah, so I was a delegate in the Australia-India Youth Dialogue in 2020. Now, my experience with India prior to being involved in that had been very, very much in the non-government sector and very much involved in travel. And I learnt about AIYD initially when I was starting to think about how I could create a career that would support my ongoing travel with India. And then I was working at Monash at the time, and they'd been developing the gig program, and India was a big part of that. And I just had heard about the AIYD. So I actually put my application in twice. I was not very unsuccessful, but I was unsuccessful in the first attempt to be a part of it, and then was selected as a delegate in 2020. But what drew me to the AIYD, and I think this is a really important part because it's the value proposition of it, even though it is now 10 years old, is that it creates a platform for young people to develop the types of people-to-people relationships that are the foundation of collaboration and partnership that you then need to support any bilateral relationship. It's really about, and it started in 2012 with a vision of, again, creating a space where young people could come together and learn about one another, develop that cross-cultural understanding to then go forward into their lives. How do you work with another person when your background is entirely different? So that was really, now I know the co-founders well, and I actually believe you may have had Sean Starr on this program as well. And I think they were visionaries at the time, because what that has now evolved into is the premier leadership dialogue between the two countries, between Australia and India, where it still rests on that idea that if you bring young people together, not only will they develop a deeper understanding of one another, but they're going to find ways to collaborate. So each year we bring 15 young people from Australia and India together, where they really get a chance to discuss issues of significance to both Australia and India. Each year it alternates between Australia and India. This year, 2023, it will be in India. We'll be launching in Delhi and Bengaluru in September. And it's really about, I think, another value proposition that I'm quite proud of, and really it was another thing that drew me to the dialogue, was we have people that already deeply engaged with India and the bilateral space, but we also have people that are not. And what that then does is exposes a whole new generation of leaders to be involved in the bilateral, to understand what the opportunities are, to understand what some of the challenges are for the bilateral. And that's what we'll look at specifically this year, is if we are thinking about the way that megatrends are shaping the world, now be that climate change, AI, shifting demographics, whatever that might be, what does that look like in 12 months? What does that look like in 5 years, in 10 years? How is the Australia-India bilateral relationship shaping and being shaped by those different trends? And then what's the importance of young people being a part of that? That's another key part of it, is, all of these things are being either driven by young people or are going to impact young people the most. So the significance of something like the dialogue is it makes sure that we're at the table when these things are being discussed. How do you make sure that we're part of the conversation when it comes to talking about how Australia and India are going to respond to climate change, for example?
I think this is absolutely fabulous, that you're part of a dialogue like this, because it really, really helps, young people engage with a country that geographically is so distant. But, it's almost like psychologically bridging the gap and, getting to know each other better. Bodean, thank you so much. The absolute scope of the work that you've done is so impressive, and it's such a privilege for us to have you with us. And I think there's so much more that you're going to do, that we're going to have you with us again really soon. So thank you so much for taking time out. I know you're traveling, and you've done this specifically for us, but thank you so much, and we hope to have you on again, and take this series forward, keeping in mind this very critical, new, very quickly developing relationship between India and Australia on the Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much, Bodean.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.